So Stephan is our first expert. So we will organize this kind of panels throughout this year and next year, and also during the third year of our project. My name is Emel Parlardal. I am full professor. I'm professor of international relations at Marmara University's International Relations Department. And today I'll be your moderator. I'll be moderator of this panel. So you'll be hearing a presentation from Dr. Stephan Klingebiel from EUSUSGOV, previously German Development Institute, or DIA, on this timely subject, which is development cooperation. But before we get started, let me introduce Dr. Stephan Klingebiel. I'll read his bio in 1 minute. Then I'll give the floor to Stephan, and he'll be talking about his presentation, which is on development cooperation. Dr. Stephan Klingebiel is head of research program, inter and transnational cooperation at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, EUSUSGOV, formerly German Development Institute in Bonn. He was director of the UNDP Global Policy Center in Seoul from June 2019 to June 2021. Previously, he was founding director of German Development Bank Office in Kigali, Rwanda, in charge of Germany's financial cooperation with the partner country. His research on university teaching focuses on innovations for inter and transnational cooperation, political economy of aid and development effectiveness, global public goods, rising powers and governance, and conflict issues. He was a guest researcher at the Center on Democracy, Development and the Rule of Law at Stanford University in 2014, and the College of Humanities and Development Studies at the China Agricultural University in Beijing in 2017. From 2011 to 2019, he was a regular visiting professor at Stanford University. Since 2014, Stephan Klingebiel is a senior lecturer at the University of Marburg. In addition, he is an honorary distinguished fellow at the Center for Sustainability, Jindal Global University, India. So this is your bio. If there is something you should add, or if you want to complete this one, you can interrupt. So, Stephan, the floor is yours. You can start your presentation. And then I'll give the floor to the attendees, to our audience, and they will perhaps ask you some questions, or they will give some comments. So we'll continue as such. As I said you before, you have maximum 30 minutes, but you can, of course, add additional 5 or 6 or 7 minutes if you want. Then I'll take some questions, and we will finalize this seminar in an hour, or maximum in an hour, 15 minutes, something like that. Okay, it will not be a too long seminar. Okay.
Okay. Wait. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Emel Parlardal. Thank you for this kind invitation. And you see, I'm not an IT expert, and really happy to share with you some of my views on development cooperation. So let me just jump in. So first of all, looking a bit at the context of development cooperation, I think what we currently see is really a paradox. A paradox in a way that I would say we have a huge need for global cooperation, or I would even say it's not just cooperation, but collaboration. So collaboration would indicate that we need better quality of cooperation, in the way that we have a number of crisis situations. I'm not going to the details here, but of course, for the last almost 3 years, we are facing the pandemic crisis with a number of socioeconomic implications. We have security situations with regard to the Russian aggression in the Ukraine, but of course also beyond. Just mentioning a few others, the situation in Yemen or in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. we have an autocratization trend in almost all regions of the world. So majority of people in the world are governed by autocratic leaders. Last but not least, we have climate change consequences in many ways. So huge need for more and better cooperation. And why I'm talking about a paradox, because on the other hand, we have little capacity to cope with those challenges. And this little capacity to cope with these challenges is related to a very tense situation of international relations. Of course, just looking at the situation, the Russian aggression, this has triggered a number of additional tense situations with regard to the United Nations, but also beyond, just looking at, you know, G20 summit in Indonesia, etc. So this is very much related to this Russian aggression, but it goes well beyond. As we all know, I think for the last couple of years, including this year, we saw a much more tense situation between the West, or more specifically the United States and China. And we all understand that this kind of relationship, strained or tense relationship between China, to some extent Europe, and China is probably dominating international relations to a very large extent in the near and middle future, with a number of implications. We see a thinning of multilateralism related to this kind of strained international relations situation. But this is also, to a large extent, based or grounded or founded by populist and nationalist governments in OECD countries, but also in the global south. So many countries have a very clear focus on domestic agendas. Just to mention some, like UK, Trump United States, but also a number of countries in the south, like Brazil under Bolsonaro, etc., have this kind of, let's say, anti-multilateral approach. This has a number of implications also on the dynamics and functioning of international fora. I think United Nations, that's the most inclusive fora, is suffering to a large extent. What we might see is an even more pronounced club governance approach that like-minded countries might play a more important role in the future. This leads to, I would say, two main guiding questions for our discussion: how to find a strategic approach in times of permanent crisis, but also how to manage the dominance of geopolitical confrontation. One other aspect I want to mention before rather focusing more narrowly on development cooperation, that's of course the fundamental challenges based on climate change. We all understand that developing countries are increasingly contributing to the level of greenhouse gas emissions. So roughly 2/3 of global emissions are coming from developing countries, more specifically, mainly from middle-income countries. If you just focus on China, China is contributing around 30% of global emissions. China alone. This doesn't mean that high-income countries do not have a role. Historically, they are the main contributors, and they are still contributing in a very significant way emissions. So high-income countries, OECD countries, have a very important role to in this regard. What is quite relevant, and just as a link to the last climate change conference, the COP conference in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, is that we have very important discussions which actor needs to do what. And you probably were following a bit this kind of loss and damage discussion, that we need to establish a fund where low-income countries are compensated to some extent because of damage caused by other countries. And one main question in this regard is who should contribute to those to this fund? And I think everybody would agree that high-income countries have a special responsibility in this regard. But the main question is, how about those developing countries which are better off? And this relates to China, of course, but also to a number of countries in the Arab region, Saudi Arabia and others. And that's one main line of conflict at the moment when it comes to climate change and international climate finance. Last point here is developing countries and emerging economies have an important role to play for this debate, but they are also suffering to a much larger extent because of the consequences of climate change. We know, for example, that a number of small islands in the Pacific really depend very much on the sea level. We also saw the very significant consequences of climate change in this year in Pakistan, the floods, etc., etc. So developing countries are much more affected by it, but they have also less capacity, less resilient system to manage those systems. So this is also very relevant. Let me just, and this is just to indicate the largest cumulative.
Stephan, I'm interrupting you, but we couldn't see your screen completely. We just see some part of your graphs, for example. What is the problem? I couldn't understand. So we see German. Now we see the half of your table. Perhaps it's better that you use slideshow or F5.
Sorry for this.
No problem. But I'm just saying because perhaps our students are trying to see your graphics, your tables, and we are just seeing.
Something is really wrong today with.
No problem, but I think perhaps it is about how you start your presentation. Perhaps you are using it in a different way. You can use slideshow section or F5.
Sorry for this.
Okay, no problem. Okay, now it is okay. We can.
Now it's okay. Okay.
Okay, it is okay. Yeah, we can see it.
Can you see it completely or partly?
We cannot see it completely, but it is better than the previous one.
Okay. So you see it partly.
Yeah, we see it partly. We see only the resource section and German Development Institute section and some part of the graphics.
So I really do not know how it comes.
Okay, no problem. Perhaps you can send us the slides after if it will not work in that way. So you don't need to get
still the same? Still the same?
It is still the same. So you don't need to get stressed. You can perhaps.
Okay, I'm really sorry for it.
Okay, no problem. If you want, you can send me your slides and then I can share these slides with our students, colleagues.
Okay, okay, I will do it later on. Okay, okay. Really sorry for all the technical issues today.
No problem at all.
Okay, let's just turn to development cooperation itself. What those global dynamics mean for development cooperation. So first of all, let me say that for the last almost 3 years, we really see pressing needs in developing countries because of the multiple crisis situations. And this is because of the pandemic, but also the war in Ukraine. And just to indicate, or to use one indicator, you might know the Human Development Index introduced by UNDP in 1990. For the first time, this indicator was negative for 2 years in a row, 2020 and 21. Never before this indicator was on average on a global level negative, and 2020 and 21, 2 years in a row, indicating that on a household level, but also on the country level in developing countries, the situation is really a very dramatic one. And people are suffering, but we have also instability and political decay in a number of countries. I mean, just looking at Sri Lanka, for example, we saw this year a number of implications because of the governance situation in the country, but very much, enforced or created much more damage because of those crisis situations. We have much less momentum for the 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals because the political attention is taken away for those crisis situations. So this means 2030 agenda and its SDGs are playing much less role. Just looking at what I would call development paradigms, I think we are used that we have something like a competition on development paradigms. It was, traditionally dominated by OECD countries and by the OECD itself. But what we saw over the last couple of years is that we have more competing, more relevant other initiatives. Just to highlight some of them, President Xi, China's President Xi, announced during the UN General Assembly in 21 in New York, China's Global Development Initiative, in addition to the Belt and Road Initiative. So that's a very important Global Development Initiative, which is intended, just using the words of President Xi, to support efforts by the United Nations. This is attracting a lot of attention by many actors. The European Union, you might have seen it just 1 year ago, launched the Global Gateway Initiative, which is to some extent a competitive development paradigm, also using infrastructure support. And we have also some other actors coming up with similar initiatives. From the United States, we have a joint initiative by the G7, and we have also by the OECD ministerial level from the end of 21, the announcement that the OECD should come up with a new development paradigm. And so what I want to say here is that development paradigms are nowadays part of a geopolitical competition, part of a soft power capacity of nations. Just a few other aspects I want to mention here is that if you see the slide, you see this nice graph with, upward trend that ODA resources until 21 are going up. What I want to say here is that just looking at this budget situation in many OECD countries, I would anticipate some ODA. ODA means official development assistance or development cooperation, budget constraints in the near future. just based on the economic situation we are facing globally, including the OECD. Just looking at the situation that a number of countries like Germany pay or need to pay more attention to military spending. And this might lead to a situation where ODA resources are less available. And just looking at some countries like the UK, like Norway, like Sweden, we have already concrete announcements, or to some extent, like in the UK, that those announcements to make aid cuts are already implemented. Let me also add one more point: changing role and relevance of ODA. That would be also a very important discussion, because just to indicate or to pick out one trend, the graduation of countries. Graduation of countries or graduation of developing countries means that over a longer period of time, a number of countries were quite successful in terms of development. Yeah, just looking, for example, at some Southern European countries like Spain or Greece or Portugal, those were former developing countries, and they graduated. They are now high-income countries. We have other countries like Chile. Chile graduated from being a developing country to a developed country just 2 years ago. And this applies to some other countries. And we will see further graduation of more countries. Yeah? China is expected to graduate in the near future. Turkey, by the way, the same. So the group of potential development cooperation receivers is shrinking. This, to a large extent, good news, because it means countries are progressing. At the same time, it has a number of implications, of course, for the policy field development cooperation. So changing role and relevance of ODA is something what is highly relevant. Let me also add few more points with regard to ODA as a main tool of development cooperation used by OECD countries, those countries which belong to the Development Assistance Committee, DAC, which is a traditional donor club. And here we have a number of discussions around how to keep up credibility and transparency of the ODA reporting system. I just to flag this point, because sometimes international reporting is also a quite relevant, significant incentive for countries to perform. Yeah? And just looking at the current situation, where a number of developing countries highlight that their trust in OECD countries is quite small. This is also based in those aspects like do really OECD countries live up their commitment when it comes to development cooperation promises, etc. So we have a couple of issues around this. Let me just highlight one last point for this, the changing role and views on South-South cooperation. I think the South-South cooperation discourse for a number of years was that this is something what is very much welcome by all actors in the world, that it's good to see that BRICS countries and other countries are contributing to the provision of global public goods. This kind of discussion, discourse, perspective is still there, but it's changing. To some extent, it's changing because this picture is very much dominated by China and China's Belt and Road Initiative. And China is now seen much more in this kind of competitive situation and context. But it's also changing because South-South cooperation is now something what not just the big quite advanced developing countries are providing, like China, like India, like South Africa, but even least developed countries like Rwanda. So South cooperation is also used to some extent by some low-income countries as a soft power. So let me just move on. What does it mean for the way ahead when it comes to development cooperation discussions? What does it mean for our understanding on development cooperation? So first of all, let me just focus a bit on the changing narrative. I think what we really need to understand is that the entire rationale of development cooperation is changing to a large extent. Just looking at the original definition of ODA, ODA was expected to contribute to the national social and economic development of partner countries. National social and economic development of partner countries. To some extent, this is still true. But looking at the main rationale, how many OECD countries use and allocate nowadays their resources, that's quite different. Let me just give you some examples. Development cooperation is nowadays used to a large extent to contribute to international climate finance. Yeah? And this is why I was highlighting international climate change as a challenge. So in the case of Germany, but this is very similar also for other countries. Here from our Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, around 88% of Germany's international climate finance is coming from this ministry. I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but what I'm saying is international climate finance as a global public good is now coming from ODA resources. We have a similar situation when it comes to other topics like global health, yeah, COVID or Ebola. This is very much that OECD countries want to allocate the resources to avoid a situation where Ebola is, for example, spreading to other countries. Security, just looking at how European countries are focusing on the Sahel region, this is something where, you know, European actors are also having in mind that security is something what is also affecting the situation in Europe. So what I want to say is, this is not that I want to complain about the rationale, but it's much less about the national development of those countries, but it's much more about co-benefits for us. Let me just rush to a few final points because I'm probably overstretching my time budget. So what I was already indicating is that we have a conceptual relationship and overlap between ODA and international climate finance. I think this is a very significant one, and this will be even more pronounced in the near future. And I think we have still not yet those discussions, strategic discussions, which are needed in this. Final slide, hopefully you see at least some parts of it. I would also highlight that we in development cooperation, development policy, we need to consider some more strategic elements which are needed. One is strategic foresight. I mean, this is now used by many actors in the context of foreign affairs, diplomacy, security, etc. And we are not really using this kind of scenario building, strategic foresight approaches to address geopolitical, but also other aspects for development cooperation. So in this regard, I think we need to catch up. We need to have some kind of reflections on the aid and development effectiveness discussion. Just looking back 10, 15 years ago, the main discourse on development cooperation was on how to make development cooperation more effective. Yeah? We have a number of platforms like the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. Next week, there will be the third high-level meeting on this. This was a predominant discourse for many, many years. This is now just a sideshow because of the crisis situation we are facing, and that political decision makers are paying much more attention to other topics. So we need to think about what does aid and development effectiveness mean is in this kind of new context. Last but not least, as a very last point, we have something what is called policy coherence for development or policy coherence for sustainable development discourse for many, many years. This is not new. And this was always about how to make sure that other policy fields like trade, security, etc., are not affecting in a negative way development cooperation activities. What is new here is, I think, that we see increasingly the need to think about managing the interfaces between development policy and other actors, not just from our perspective, but also from the perspective of those actors. Yeah, just we were discussing already climate change, security. Just think about migration, which is a big topic for the US, which is a big topic for the European Union and others. This kind of interface management of different policy fields is something what is very much needed for our policy field. So this is just to indicate that we need to have this kind of strategic discussion on this. And with this, I would like to come to an end of my presentation. Sorry again for all these technical issues. I hope you were able to follow at least to some extent what I was trying to say. And with this, back to you, Emma.
Thank you very much, Stephan. It was a very insightful and very fruitful and very interesting topic. So I took a lot of notes. I took your picture and I shared on Twitter, and I asked my assistant to share your presentation via Twitter. But at the same time, I took lots of notes. So perhaps if we can have a short wrap-up section, we can talk about them briefly. But before that, I would like to give the floor to our attendees, to our audience. Perhaps some interesting questions may come, and then this can open a new debate, and we can all contribute to these discussions all together. So thank you very much again. It was very interesting and it was very insightful. So I would like to give the floor to the audience. Are there any questions, comments? But before, I would like to ask all the attendees to present themselves very briefly, and then ask their questions or give their comments to our speaker, Dr. Stephan Klingebiel. So who wants to ask the first question or give the first comment? Please raise your hand, then present yourself, and then you can ask your question directly to Stephan. Who wants to be the first? Nobody. No questions, no comments. I think I see some students from my previous classes. Some of them wrote articles on development cooperation. So we have a question. I think it is written on the chat. So thank you very much for the presentation. Okay, any questions, any remarks? Is Samira here, my ex-student Samira? Okay, Samira, please.
Yeah.
How are you, Samira?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Samira is our ex-student. She returned back to Burkina Faso. She became assistant professor there, and she recently received an important grant from International Studies Association. Congratulations, Samira, too.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you so much, Dr. Stephan. Thank you for this great presentation. It was really informative and I really loved listening to you. So my name is Dipama, Dr. Samiratu Dipama. I was an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations of Tokatgas Osman Pasha University in Turkey. But as Professor Emel said, I'm now based in Burkina Faso, where I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Political Science and Law of Thomas Sankara University. So I have two questions for Dr. Stephan. The first one, what could be the implications of the rise of these potential donors like China and Turkey for development cooperation effectiveness in the recipient countries? This is the first one. Should I follow up or wait for the reply?
It depends on Stephan. Stephan, would you like to make the questions and then give an answer to the totality of the questions, or would you like to take them by one? What is your preference?
Yeah, maybe you just add your second question as well, and I'm trying to cover both of them.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much. And the second one is related to the development cooperation frameworks. We have seen that lots of aid and development cooperation frameworks and concepts have been elaborated since the 2000s, ranging from the Paris Declaration to the Busan Partnership. And then now we are talking about humanitarian development and peace concepts. But we can see that most of these frameworks and concepts produced limited results in terms of boosting the development of the recipient countries. What can explain the limited results of these frameworks? Like, where is the main challenge, or where is the issue? Why these frameworks, these concepts, they are constantly elaborated, updated, but they seem to produce limited results in terms of boosting the development of the recipient countries? What can explain these limited results? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Samira.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Samira, too. Very good questions and really a nice challenge. So first of all, what are implications of what China, Turkey, other countries are doing in terms of South-South cooperation? Not just one response, but rather, highlighting some elements. First of all, I think for most South-South cooperation providers, what is quite important is that what those actors are doing is not identical with development cooperation of OECD countries. So countries like India, countries like China, highlight that their understanding of South-South cooperation is quite different. So if you look at what India and China, what they are doing, for example, a number of trade activities, for example, commercial investment activities, are part of their understanding of South-South cooperation. This wouldn't be part of our thinking when it comes to OECD countries. This doesn't apply to all South-South cooperation providers, but to many. And this leads me to another aspect. There isn't something like one understanding of South-South cooperation. I think one advantage we have when it comes to ODA and OECD countries is there's one platform, and this platform is used to develop norms and standards about development cooperation. For South-South cooperation, we do not have something like this. We had a main UN conference on South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation in early 2019 in Buenos Aires, BAPA +40. And there was some kind of hope that this conference would come up with one understanding, one definition, but we do not have something like this. So This also means that we have some South-South cooperation providers which with a quite similar understanding of what development cooperation is, like what Mexico is doing. But you know, the group of South-South cooperation providers doesn't exist, and there isn't any you know, one definition for it. What does it mean for partner countries? I think, first of all, for partner countries on the African continent, in Asia, but also in Latin America, first of all, to see this kind of rise of South-South cooperation providers is good news, because there are many more options, many more options. You have access to more resources. You can use the situation also that actors are competing to some extent. So this is from the perspective of partner countries, I think, on average, good news. This doesn't exclude some challenges and problems. Just think about the loan situation, the credit situation, the debt situation for a number of developing countries because of what China is doing, for example. Or, I mean, China is not an example, but China is really the dominant actor in this regard. For a number of countries like Zambia or Sri Lanka, that we have a high level of indebtedness by many countries collaborating with China. And this has led to a situation over the last couple of years that we see quite high level of dependency, economic dependency, sometimes also political dependency from China. So it's a very nuanced picture in this regard, I would say. Your second question, and I need to be a bit briefer, Paris Declaration and all the other events on aid and development effectiveness. I think you're absolutely right that the positive implications, the results are very limited of those political declarations and those high-level meetings. And I would really agree with this. Why do we have this kind of situation? I would highlight two aspects in this regard. The first one is, I think, the aid and development effectiveness agenda was from the very beginning a quite technical agenda. I think a lot of attention on the level of experts, of you know, people who are really familiar with this kind of business, but with little commitment or ownership rather on the political level. So this is one aspect. The other aspect is of course South-South cooperation and this kind of competition, development competition, which is now a very predominant aspect for development cooperation providers. And this is that to some extent, I think, looking back 15 years ago, many actors were expecting that we would see Northernization of South-South cooperation. So that South-South cooperation providers would apply to a large extent norms and standard of OECD countries. In reality, what we saw over the last 5 to 10 years is a situation the other way around. Let's say South-South cooperation is talking a lot about or mutual benefits for both sides. This was excluded for OECD development cooperation providers for many years. What we saw over the last couple of years is that OECD countries are also using now similar concepts. So what I want to say is that we see rather a Southernization of what Northern development cooperation providers are doing. And this doesn't exclude 100% aid and development effectiveness elements, but it's providing some some limitations and constraints in this regard. So those are, I think, some explanations from my side why this aid effectiveness agenda wasn't that successful, at least with the long-term perspective.
Thank you very much, Stephan. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Stephan. Thanks a lot.
We have other questions in the chat, so perhaps I can start from the first question. Yeah, Yasir Rashid. Dear sir, my question is how the Russian-Ukrainian war as a geopolitical tension, how does Russian-Ukrainian war as a geopolitical tension conflict affect international development cooperation? And he continues by asking, where will be the place of EU global gateway strategic international development cooperation? So he has two questions. So you can combine them and answer them all.
Okay, let me try to respond to it, and I'm trying to be a bit more brief now. Russian aggression in Ukraine, yes, very much affecting the situation in developing countries. What I was already trying to say is this is really a socioeconomic consequence for developing countries. So in a way, what we see is that development cooperation is paying much more attention to tackle the crisis situation. So the need to use development cooperation for humanitarian purposes is much more present nowadays. So this is one aspect. We are most likely also going to see this kind of new allocation focused to some extent on Ukraine and Eastern Europe. Yeah, probably not 100%, but to a large extent. And I mean, just looking at how much we are focusing on what kind of election pattern do we see in the UN General Assembly, we might also see that aid allocation decisions are most likely based to a larger extent in the future also on how close do we see some countries to us as an ally. So that's one aspect. EU global gateway strategy in international development cooperation. So what is important to say is this is a quite significant initiative, 300 billion euro. That's quite an important amount of money. Not only development cooperation resources, but also other public resources and even more importantly, a number of private sector resources. So this is an initiative which includes development cooperation, but it goes well beyond development cooperation. That's quite important to understand.
Thank you very much. Now I'll move to the following question. Sandhya ER, thanks for providing valuable insights on contemporary challenges of development cooperation. My question, Professor Stephan, if development cooperation is driven by emerging geopolitical processes, how would the financing for SDGs be aligned? And the second associated question is, what is the role of emerging countries in shaping an alternate mechanism? When I use the domain of emerging economies, I'm trying to get some direction on South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation. So this is the second part of the question.
Yeah, thank you, and good evening, Sandhya. Really good you're with us here, and I see your questions also to some extent as a comment. I mean, there isn't any easy question. So emerging geopolitical aspects and financing for SDGs. I think to some extent we need to find out what are really implications. I mean, we have in Europe, I think right now, a number of discussions that we see this kind of more pronounced geopolitical context for development cooperation and for the future allocation. But for me, it's not really that clear. What does it mean? Is it that we will provide or focus our development cooperation resources more on those countries which are politically quite close to us? Or are we rather trying to convince those countries where we see, you know, some kind of not clear positioning that we are trying to convince them? Yeah? I mean, Sania, you know that the German Minister of Foreign Affairs, she's currently in India, and in India, but also in Germany, we have a number of discussions about how is this kind of geopolitical situation now affecting the relationship between both countries. I think this is not that we know it already. I think it will need to be seen in the near future how those aspects are affecting our relationship. Let me just next question of Sania when I use it in those alternative mechanisms aspects. Yes, I think this is a good question. I mean, again, maybe some elements of a response. First of all, I do not see new dynamic elements with regard to the South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation discussion for the last 2, 3, 4 years, I must say. Since BAPA +40, the conference in Buenos Aires, I do not really see that BRICS countries, IPSA countries, other formats of countries are really pushing this kind of South-South cooperation or triangular cooperation discussion. And something like we are close to a joint understanding of South-South cooperation, I don't see it. So in a way, there is even less momentum of Southern countries to come up with a joint understanding. At the same time, we see that India's G20 presidency, which just started on December 1st, might be one main initiative to push a global development debate. And it might also include not just development in a broader sense, but also development cooperation in a more narrow sense. Whether this will lead to something where we get a clearer understanding what South-South and triangular cooperation, I think that's pretty clear. It's rather South-South cooperation. But whether G20 might come up with something in this regard, I doubt. But what G20 under India's presidency might provide is a global platform on development cooperation as such. As we all know, we do not really have a functioning global platform on development cooperation so far. The Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation is not accepted by most important South-South cooperation providers, including India, including China, including South Africa and Brazil. They are not part of it. We have the UNDCF, which is an inclusive platform, but not very effective. So in a way, we do not really have a global effective platform in this regard. And to see that the G20 might provide a platform in many ways, including development cooperation, could be one option where India could try to leave some kind of, positive or lead a positive agenda to provide a framing like this. So that would be my response to this.
Thank you very much, Stephan. Now I'll move to the second question following Sandia's question. Galip, which other regional organizations are also engaged in development cooperation as much as the EU? And For instance, do Mercosur or ASEAN have a development cooperation agenda? And as a second question, do BRICS and MICTA, like informal IOs, also consider strengthening their leadership in development cooperation? So he asks the role of regional organizations and informal IOs in strengthening or in implementing global development cooperation agenda. So do they have a roadmap or etc.?
Yeah, thank you for this. I do not see any other regional organization similar to the European Union as a provider of development cooperation. I think what we see is that a number of regional organizations, regional and continental organizations, are partners for development cooperation, but not so much providers. Yeah, like the African Union or the regional organizations on the African continent, they are very much partners for development cooperation, but not so much providers. The second question, do BRICS MICTA like I think what we saw over the last couple of years is that some of those club governance groups like BRICS and MICTA, that they want to play a role in development cooperation. We have a working group under BRICS on development. We have a rather new working group on development under MICTA since 2020, when South Korea was leading MICTA. Yes, we have those trends, but those are rather informal platforms of brainstorming those topics without any binding character. And this is something what we were expecting to some extent from the BRICS groups for some years, that this group would come up with a definition about South-South cooperation, but I think the BRICS group was not able or didn't intend really to come up with something like this. For MICTA, it's a bit different because MICTA is not just a Southern group, but it's a mixed group. It's Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Turkey, and Australia. So it's really a mixed group. And I think there's a lot of potential for a mixed group. But in this regard, they have at the same time little similar identities, because those countries are from the global north, are coming from the global south, and it might be seen as something like a pilot, but they are not representing a specific group. Yeah? So that would be my response to this.
Thank you very much. We have a new question from Mert Masumko. Domestic policies of developing countries also affect international development cooperation much. Since the development of China and others, we saw a rise and empowerment of middle classes. But after the COVID, we see that even in the US and other European states, middle classes become creeped by inequalities. While in China and Russia, these classes are now under an effort to exercise authoritarian control. From now, could we achieve a development cooperation and sustainable development without middle classes? So I think he wants to ask about the changing conditions of middle classes in world politics, and he's trying to ask you whether without the middle classes, how can effective development cooperation be achieved in international politics? I think it is what I understood from this question.
Maybe just briefly commenting on it. I mean, again, this is a very interesting comment. I think we have this kind of middle class discussion for a couple of years now. Yes, we understand middle classes are growing in a number of middle income countries. We also see a rising inequality situation in many countries, developing countries, not at least because of the pandemic. This is also affecting middle classes, that to some extent middle classes are suffering to large extent in a number of countries. This is affecting stability of those countries. Does it affect directly development cooperation? I'm not so sure about it. I mean, middle classes are important for the development of countries, but does it really affect development cooperation per se? Probably not so much. Maybe if you have any other idea, let me know, but I don't see this kind of direct link to development cooperation.
Thank you very much. A new question has just arrived. It's from Aida. Dr. Klingebiel, many thanks for the detailed presentation. Sorry for the technical problem. As you mentioned in your presentation, development cooperation has been instrumentalized by some states to upgrade their status. Isn't it a real obstacle for international development cooperation?
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, development cooperation has been instrumentalized. Yes, it's part of soft power capacity of UK, of France, of United States, of Germany, but also Turkey and South Korea and China and other countries. Yes, it's like this. And is it something what is good or bad? I'm not sure, because this is also, I think, to some extent, or it was a very positive competition to say, okay, let's be ambitious about that countries should contribute to global public goods, should contribute to the achievement of SDGs, and this will also increase their reputation. Yeah, and that's also soft power. I think what is a bit more, you know, a more complicated discussion we should have right now is in how far this is not just, you know, upgrading their status and their soft power capacity, but in how far this is also supporting, let's say, rather traditional national self-interests. Yeah, and I mean, this is the situation when we are now looking at geopolitical discussions, that we are very much, you know, back to some extent that development cooperation should serve those national interests, and then it becomes a bit more complicated, I would say. So yes, you are right. It's an instrument for soft power capacity, but this is not bad per se, I would say.
Thank you very much. Any questions, any comments? On behalf of the entire project team, thank you very much. Okay, thank you. Any comments, any further comments, questions about development cooperation, its new trends, its new limitations, and so about what Stephan mentioned in his presentation. I think we don't have questions and comments. So as a last point, I would like to ask a question to you, and then I will finalize our presentation. I don't want to take too much your time. So you talk about development, the new trends and the obstacles that the world and we are all engaging in this era of geopolitical rivalries, in this era of geopolitical conflicts. You said that development cooperation now is changing. There is the momentum for development cooperation is changing. And as you said, the competition is very beneficial for not only developed countries, but also for the developing world. So there must be a competition in the sphere of development cooperation. So we must motivate, we must push developing countries to allocate their resources to this file. But on the other hand, there is also a rising interest from the side of developing countries to climate change issues. And as you said, most of the developed countries are actually allocating their resources to climate finance and climate funds. So this is a sort of obstacle to future, to strengthening development cooperation at international level. So how can we find, or how, for example, Germany will try to find a balance between its climate engagement and its development engagement? I think we need to find a delicate balance, because otherwise most of the developed countries will allocate most of their resources to climate change, but also there is a need to finding funds and contribute financially to international to development cooperation, because it is also one of the priorities of the developed world. So how do you see it will happen? For example, what is the solution of Germany, or what is the solution? What may be the solution of other developed countries? How will they balance this?
Yeah, I think this is really a very fundamental and important question, and it's relevant for bilateral donors, but also for the multilateral development banks, and we see this kind of trend. So first of all, and again, this is not, you know, one easy answer or response. One aspect is between climate finance and development objectives, we have a lot of co-benefits. Yeah, I mean, I was saying that developing countries are suffering a lot because of the consequences of climate change. So everything what is helpful in this regard will be a benefit for developing countries. Yeah, and so that's for clear. That's a clear co-benefit, and sometimes this is also taking place on a micro level. Yeah? You improve the situation in a region, so the next flood might be less damageful, harmful, because of reforestation efforts. Yeah, something like this. So we have a number of co-benefits. At the same time, I would also say there are some real trade-offs. Now, if you look at international climate finance, we have one main distinction. This is between mitigation and adaptation. If you ask a country, let's say Burundi, let's ask Bangladesh or another country, we have this amount of money, we can use it for climate finance to invest it in your country. Would you like to see this money invested in adaptation or mitigation? The typical response would be adaptation, because then our country, will benefit most to adjust to a new situation, to protect us against the consequences of the next flood, something like this. If you look at the preferences, the priorities of many donors of international climate finance, this is on mitigation. This is on mitigation because this is really a global public good. So we try to invest in energy transformation in a specific country, one of the big emerging countries. So let's try to reduce the emissions, and the benefits, they will go to all countries. So in a way, this is of course in the interest of all donor countries. But if you would ask the specific partner country, probably they would say, yes, nice to have, but you know, it's a collective good. And you have those issues you always have when it comes to collective goods, that you are rather trying to focus on direct effects for your country. So what I want to say is, yes, there are a number of co-benefits, but there are also some trade-offs, yeah, and a question of priority setting. And this will be much more relevant in the near future. Yeah, or let me also give to you one last example. If you think about reducing emissions, we will focus on dynamic middle-income countries. This would also mean that less resources are available for low-income countries. They are not, you know, contributing a lot of global greenhouse gases. So in a way, attention is moving away from low-income countries. So this might be also one consequence, one trade-off. So in this regard, I think this is a highly relevant topic, since we will see this kind of increasing overlap between international climate finance and development finance. This will be most likely one of the main topics for the next couple of years.
Yes, you are right. Thank you very much, Stephan. Thank you for your interesting presentation. It was very timely. And thank you for answering all our questions. Thank you very much for participating to our session as our first expert.
Thank you so much for your interest, your great questions and comments, and for hosting me.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you again. Yeah. And also I would like to thank the audience for their questions and for their comments and for their participation, for participating to our event. I would like to send you all my greetings and have a nice Christmas. It is a little bit early to say this, but have a nice Christmas. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All the best to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
See you again somewhere. Thank you for coming. It was really good to see you. Thank you. Bye-bye.